Beloveds, it is good to be with you this morning. I bring you greetings from your Pacific Western Region staff of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And I begin this morning with a story. A handful of years ago, I was walking around my backyard. It was fall, though in Southern California style, it was still quite hot. The sun shone in a way to make the flowers and the succulents in my yard pop with color. This was a place that I was still just getting to know, having only lived there for maybe a year and a half, but already finding great solace in the yard. This particular fall day, my spirit was weary. It had been a long summer leading into a busy fall, and lots was changing around me. It was the afternoon of Erev Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and in our household, it had become a tradition for me to pick up a pomegranate for my Jewish wife in celebration of the sweet New Year. But I hadn't this year. That afternoon, I finally had the mental space and a very short window of time to stop at a store and pick one up, but there were none there. I was sad and disappointed in myself, which I soon came to realize how much that pomegranate had become a symbol of all the things I had failed to do or get right in the midst of the change, all the things I wish had been different but weren't. I was pretty far down that well of thinking when something caught my eye on the retaining wall in the back of our yard. It was brightly colored and stuck out against the browns and greens around it. It seemed as though one of our neighbor kids must have kicked their ball across the fence. I went to retrieve it so I could return it to them. Only when I got close, I realized this bright sphere wasn't a ball at all. It was a pomegranate, ripe and whole and still attached to the tree. I hadn't even realized that in the midst of this bright green leaves over the last months, a small flower had bloomed and grown into a pomegranate, just in time for Rosh Hashanah. My surprise quickly turned into relief and awe at this little bit of grace that had bloomed in the midst of a changing world and waited patiently for me to slow down and notice it. Beloveds, much has changed over the last 20 plus months. Our plans keep changing indeed, to the point where that change can feel pretty constant and often leaves little or no time for noticing the pomegranates, let alone grieving the losses we've experienced of people we love, of connections, grieving the childhood we'd wished for our children, grieving the church and the community we remember. Grief, stress, trauma, weariness are so present for so many of us. When we stop for a moment, we may realize on various levels that we aren't okay, either individually or collectively. And that's okay, because we've changed. In his book, The Body Keeps a Score, Bessel van der Kolk demonstrates how chronic stress and trauma can actually change the way our brain and our bodies work. It gets stored in us and changes how we are. Van der Kolk says in a 2016 interview that people who suffer from trauma often want to forget it because it's too much, and society wants to forget it because it's too much also. How much more true is this when the entire society has experienced something major, which many experience as trauma? But we don't forget, at least our bodies don't. So what do we do with that? One of the first things we can do is to pay attention. So, would you do an experiment with me this morning? As much as it's accessible to you right now and without judgment, without thinking too much about it, name one emotion and one physical feeling you have right now. I'll give you just a moment. Got it? Okay. Now we're going to take just a few moments to pay attention to our body. So I invite you to center yourself however that works for you. Perhaps a couple of deep breaths are accessible to you and help you center. Perhaps rolling your shoulders and putting your feet on the ground, whatever it is that helps you get centered. And I invite you to take a moment to scan your body and just notice without judgment. Just notice. Perhaps starting at your toes and scanning all the way up to the top of your head, just noticing. What did you notice? Were there areas of tension, stress, pain, joy, release? Now, here's something that will be a welcome invitation or a challenge to some of us, but I invite you to enter it as much as makes sense for you this morning. I want you to find some movement that feels good to you. That might be as small as rolling your shoulders, as wiggling your fingers. It might be big and exuberant and dancing and moving around. It might be tensing and releasing your muscles, or simple wiggle. Or if physical movement is not accessible, not okay with your body this morning, simply bringing your attention to one of those physical places and sending some love there. I'll give you a few seconds to try that out. Just move however works for your body. Get some of that movement. Now, I can't see the sanctuary of gathered folks, so I'm just imagining that you are all over the place just dancing and having a great time. That's what I have in my head for you. And at home, I'm guessing you're doing the same, or whatever it is that brings you joy and brings a little movement. Now, I invite you to notice once more. When you pay attention to your body, what do you notice? Is anything different? Has anything been released? Has anything been brought into sharper focus? We are embodied beings. What we have been through and continue to go through as individuals, as congregations, and as an association, a society, a world, has already begun to find home in our bodies, both physical and collective. The concept of the fractal effect, made popular by Adrienne Marie Brown, reminds us that what happens on the micro level, on our individual level, is repeated through our relationships and our systems and our society to all the way to the macro level. Chronic stress and trauma unaddressed creates patterns in our system. We need to take time to heal the trauma, release the stress, and dream together of new ways of being together. So what if we slow down, even for a moment? Perhaps, as Morgan Harper Nichol says in the poem, perhaps in slowing down, I will learn to peel back the layers and find that even here, in the wild of my worry, my heart is still beating. Peace will still find me here. Joy will still find me here. Peace, joy, and possibility, even in the midst of this uncertainty, lies an incredible opportunity for us to reimagine our world, our fellowships in church, even our movement. Cultural theorists like Ann Swidler tell us that the formation and reformation of culture often takes place most intentionally in times when things are uncertain. To do this reformation, I firmly believe the tools we have within Unitarian Universalism are the tools we need. These tools are covenant, which may not surprise you to hear, and grace. Did you even know we had that one? First, grace. So I come from Lutheranism, a Christian tradition, and one in which the central to its theology is the notion of grace. Using the language of that tradition, at the heart of the Lutheran concept of grace is the notion that we are never beyond God's love. There's nothing we can or need to do to earn it, and therefore there's nothing we can do to lose it. Simply as creatures created in Imago Dei, the image of God or the divine, we can show up every day knowing that we are love, we are loved, and we are free to respond to others knowing the same is true for them. Even when we mess up over and over again, we are held and loved back into right relationship with ourselves and with others. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, there are parts of the underlying theology of grace, especially the parts regarding sin and salvation, that don't necessarily translate over to Unitarian Universalism. And for some of us, even the language of God or divine isn't helpful. And that's fine. Because the more I dwell in the sea of Unitarian Universalism, the more I see the need for a theology of grace. And even more hopefully, the more I find one within our Unitarian Universalist traditions. Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt writes that our first principle calls us to learn a language of resilience and liberation in response to the pain of this world we have inherited, so that we might find wholeness and grace in our brokenness. Within our stories, there's pain, there is grief, there is brokenness. And in that brokenness, we are invited to find wholeness and, yes, even grace. Finding and creating these places where wholeness and grace in our brokenness can flourish, or as our poet today says, where grace can bloom, finding those pomegranates can be difficult work, individually and collectively. But fortunately, there's another powerful tool for being community in search of wholeness, and that, of course, is covenant. As we start to imagine individually and collectively what these next months and years will bring, we still find ourselves in liminal times, one which exists between the ending and a new beginning, in which we have the opportunity to reclaim and reimagine the hope and the promise of being a covenantal community rooted in Unitarian Universalism. Covenant, as the Commission on Institutional Change reminds us in Unlocking the Power of Covenant, requires that we be present to and for one another, that we engage in community, and that we work for the good of the entire community. Covenant binds us together, holds us in love, and invites us to show up every day knowing that we are love, we are loved, and we are free to respond to others knowing the same is true for them, even as we mess up over and over again. We are held and loved back into right relationships with ourselves and others. Sound familiar? That connection between covenant and grace is not new. Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker spoke of that connection in her 1998 sermon at General Assembly, where she said, "This dimension of covenant is important for us to recover. It's an antidote to our radical individualism. We need this older sense. Covenant is brought into being by grace and sustained by practice." One of the great gifts of being a part of these congregations, this region, and indeed the entire UUA, is that our covenant calls us into a truth that our story is not one of isolation and individualism, that our I is always and indivisibly connected to our we. It is this rooting in covenant that you all demonstrate in gathering together today here as two separate but connected congregations, committed to Unitarian Universalism and the promise and hope of our movement in San Mateo County. Here we are striving together to live out the story we are creating as one whose practice is and can be rooted in radical love. Renowned queer theologian Father Patrick S. Chang explains radical love as a love so extreme that it dissolves our existing boundaries. And in this time, communities of faith and our entire movement is poised for the sacred task of imagining what a future rooted in radical love could actually look like. We get to ask, who are we? Who do we want and need to become? Knowing that becoming is an ongoing act, a practice. As we move forward, we're making choices individually and collectively about who we are and who we want to be. So as many want to rush back to normal, not only can we not do that, it's in our bodies now. We are changed. We don't have to. As we heal as individuals, as a society, as congregations, as communities, we can do so in liberative ways, even as we continue in the midst of so many uncertainties. What are the tough questions we might ask ourselves as we discern the we into what we are called in this time and place? We can ask ourselves what barriers have the last 20 plus months torn down that we do not want to build back up again? Which barriers has it laid bare? What connections has it forged that we can strengthen? What healing is yet to begin? Where has grace been blooming? The poem concludes with, "I will look back on this season with gratitude that I chose to breathe deep and travel through. I had to be stronger than I ever thought I would have to be. But even when I couldn't see it, grace was blooming fully within me." Listening deeply to one another, we can start to see where grace has been blooming for and within us. And remember, we are not alone. This covenantal community is a source of great hope and promise. We need each other to broaden our imagining and understanding of radical love and journey together in support, challenge, and indeed grace. The interconnected web of all binds us in responsibility, holds us in love, and blooms through us as grace. Our covenant with each other means that you, beloveds, are a part of a vast movement, and together we can and will move boldly toward wholeness. Amen. May it be so.
Thank you for your generosity this morning. Thank you for being here. Your presence makes a difference. We need one another. And now is the time in our service where I share with you an opportunity, one just thing. Our social justice communities identify an accessible action that all UUSM and UUFRC members and friends can take this week to make a difference in our lives and in the world. But first, I want to celebrate the collective difference that was made this week by a large coalition of groups, including those of our two congregations, to change the hearts and minds of 3 of our county supervisors, which led to the change of practice within our county sheriff's office in stopping the turnover of members of our community to ICE. Way to go, y'all. Let's keep this victory in mind as we continue to bend the arc of the universe to greater justice, compassion, and equity. And also, I want to remind you of 3 things which you already know about, but you all know that much of ministry is simply stating the obvious. So here goes. The Peninsula Multi-Faith Coalition and the Pacific Institute are hosting a picnic today, Sunday, November 14th, from 1:30 to 3:30 at Central Park in San Mateo at Picnic Area 1. Give thanks for the blessings and to give a chance to reacquaint after more than a year from interaction. Secondly is a reminder of the NAACP branch meeting this Tuesday and a presentation from Richard Rothstein, the author of The Color of Law. That's at 6 p.m. And then thirdly is the event I told you about a month ago, last month when we were together, and that is Going Beyond Land Acknowledgement, masterclass this Tuesday, November 16th. So I know you already know that, just a reminder. So this morning, I wish to share with you in the chat right now and beyond a film and dialogue on race and inclusivity through the San Mateo Together. And there's a link in the chat as well. And we will be brought to look at what each of us can do to help make San Mateo more inclusive and how we can stand together against racism. So join the City of San Mateo and the Peninsula Conflict Resolution Center for a lively interactive discussion and film. So there you have it. I hope you can attend one of these events. And our closing song this morning is, Where Do We Come From? What are we? Where are we going? Mystery, mystery. Life is a riddle and a mystery. Enjoy the journey.